Welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. First, a quick follow up from yesterday's discussion about China's increasing espionage efforts. We mentioned a bit about how China's been putting pressure on democracies, and today we've got new developments from the Philippines. Yesterday, we touched on espionage cases in London, and now we've got more news on Chinese linked spying in Southeast Asia. A couple of Filipino nationals were detained, and they've reportedly confessed to feeding critical military intel to Chinese operatives, specifically about Philippine U.S. military coordination in the South China Sea. These guys were part of a spy ring that used their jobs to leak sensitive info about resupply missions and personnel rotations. The Philippine government acted fast, shutting down the leak, but it's clear that espionage in the region is escalating, especially as tensions between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea continue to simmer. Speaking of the South China Sea, we've got Taiwan in the spotlight again today. This isn't new news. Yesterday we discussed how China's military activity around Taiwan is ramping up. Well, here's a bit of an update. It looks like PLA air sorties dropped to zero this past week. This might seem like a lull in activity, but don't be fooled. This could just be a strategic recalibration. Xi Jinping's government might be taking a breather, possibly ahead of his upcoming summit with U.S. President Trump. Even though the PLA is staying quiet in the skies, naval and Coast Guard operations in the Taiwan Strait are still ongoing. Taiwan's clearly aware of the potential for a sudden spike in activity. But at the moment, we're seeing more of a waiting game than a full military escalation. Now onto China's defense budget. As we talked about yesterday, China is pouring even more resources into its military modernization. They've just unveiled a 7% increase in their defense spending, pushing the total budget up to around $277 billion. That's a lot of zeros, but it's actually a slight slowdown compared to previous year's increases. Still, they're heavily investing in areas like advanced missile systems, naval expansions, and surveillance technologies. They're also clearing house within their leadership, with Xi Jinping continuing to consolidate power. It's the same move we've seen over the last couple of years. Increase military spending while tightening control at the top. It's like China's version of cleaning house, but with far more missiles and submarines than your average corporate restructuring. Here's where things get really interesting. China's 5-year plan, which was rolled out just a few days ago, is not just about the economy. Of course, we've mentioned China's economic troubles, weak consumption, a sluggish property market, and demographic issues. But the tech race, that's where China is doubling down. Premier Li Qiang recently set China's GDP growth target for 2026 at a modest 4.55%. This is a slight dip from last year's goal, which was also met primarily thanks to their trade surplus. But the real gold mine in this plan? China is ramping up its focus on AI, robotics, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing. If you haven't been paying attention, startups like DeepSeek, Zhipu AI, and others are now on par with what you're seeing coming out of Silicon Valley. Forget about the US dominance. These Chinese startups are innovating at a pace that Silicon Valley is now watching closely. Just imagine a scrappy startup from Beijing making OpenAI sweat. This is no longer a one-sided race, and China is proving that they're in it for the long haul. And let's not forget that China's playing chess, not checkers. They're not just focusing on tech for the sake of it. It's about national security. We've heard this before with China's strategy to secure AI dominance, but they're also getting more serious about semiconductors, rare earths, and advanced manufacturing to insulate themselves from Western tech dependencies. It's a long-term strategy, and it's already paying dividends as China positions itself as an unstoppable force in the world's most critical industries. Now, for a bit of a curveball, remember how we touched on China's involvement in the Middle East yesterday, especially with its oil interests in Iran? Well, there's been an update here too. China and Iran are in talks to ensure the safe passage of oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. This has been a big worry, especially with the rising tensions following the U.S.-Israeli strikes in Iran. China, which relies heavily on oil from the Middle East, needs that oil to keep its economy rolling. But with the conflict blocking the strait and oil prices spiking, China is sitting at a crossroads. Keep its relationship with Iran strong while also navigating the rising costs and energy uncertainties. This situation is tricky for Beijing because it's got Russian ties to juggle, along with its own economic stability at home. Energy security is a big deal for China, and this diplomatic balancing act is one they'll have to keep a close eye on. Now, before we wrap this up, China's continued patience on the global stage. Yesterday, we mentioned how China has been measured in its response to the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. They're not rushing to military involvement. In fact, their priority has been on securing energy interests and managing domestic stability. They're clearly steering clear of high-profile interventions. Classic China. They're working behind the scenes, making sure they're not getting dragged into a situation that could hurt them long-term. Think of it as a long game where China's more about global influence than quick fixes or showy displays of power. Thanks for listening and being part of the RH community. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star review. If you want to see some changes, email us at info@restrictedhandling.com. We also publish a daily written intel brief on Substack where you'll find even deeper coverage of Russia and China, along with insights on Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK.